Hey, you awesome folks! Thanks for taking this journey of discovery with your guide, Keith Haney. You're listening to the Becoming Bridge Builders podcast, your favorite podcast for everything from racial reconciliation to education innovation, justice reform, and leading change in the 21st century. This podcast is for people who love to be challenged with difficult topics, but want practical solutions to solve these challenging issues. Becoming Bridge Builders makes change possible. Each week on the podcast, Keith invites innovative thought leaders to share how they are building bridges in their area of expertise. You will hear breakthrough ideas and concepts that are changing the world. He's featuring guests who are best-selling authors, leaders at Microsoft, entrepreneurs, leading educators, professors, lawyers, and so many more. Listen in to learn how you can be the bridge to the change you are seeking.
My guest today is Richard B. Swegan. Rich is an author, founder, and principal consultant of ARC Performance. With a background in human resources and safety, Rick consults various organizations on development needs and potential leaders. He invites clients to question themselves to foster continuous learning and aspires to be the best version of themselves. The practice of ethical leadership, insights from psychology and business, and building an ethical bottom line. They offer practical suggestions for developing ethical leaders. We welcome Richard to the podcast. Well, Rick, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Keith. I appreciate you having me on.
So glad to have this conversation. Love talking about leadership, one of my passions, so I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Okay, great. Me too.
I love to ask my guests this question. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Yeah, what a great question. I'll go back about 50 years now, because it'll date me. But I was working in a small liberal arts college at the time, and we were in a relatively high pressure situation, and it was a small school. So the president happened to walk in, and he said, "Just remember, we're all playing in God's sandbox." And what I took that to mean was relax, don't take anything too seriously. We're not doing life and death here, and nor do you need to take yourself too seriously. It was the best advice I ever got. And it was, I'm sure it was an offhand 30 seconds from him. He never thought about it again, but it was wonderful.
No, I think I've heard that before. It's a good reminder, too, of not only the context in which you're in, but also the fact that you're not playing in this by yourself, that there are other people that are in the sandbox as well.
And an important point, because the other thing that I would have said in response to your question was the second best piece of advice is you're not in this alone. You know, reach out to other people, get help, don't solve everything yourself. So the two of those match up real well. Thank you.
That's great. I love to ask my guests this question, thinking about all of our careers. We don't, like you just said, we don't do this alone. We don't make this journey alone. But who are some people in your life who served as mentors or leaders that you may have looked up to or inspired you along the way?
I'll give you two, Keith. And again, it's a really good question. And I'll give you a different answer. My hero is one of my great grandfathers. His name was Thomas McClintock. And McClintock was born while Washington was president. He subsequently died after the Civil War. And he was Quaker by background and intrigued me because he raised 5 girls, but did fascinating things. He was a religious heretic as a Quaker. He was involved in 2 different schisms within the Religious Society of Friends, early abolitionist. He was friends with William Lloyd Garrison, and he hung around with Frederick Douglass. So that'll give you some sense of that. And then kind of capped his career by being part of the first group that called for the rights for women to vote in the United States in 1848. So he's intrigued me as a human being, that he would do those things and always consistently stood up for what was right. And there's a quote that, because he was hung in effigy at various points because of his stance about abolition in particular. And his comment was, and it's quoted in other sources, "As for me, I must speak the truth and abide the consequences," which was always striking to me that he was going to operate based on his conscience more than anything else. Never knew him, know of him, obviously, but he's the hero and hopefully has had a positive influence on my life.
That's an amazing story. I love that because it kind of feeds into what your book is about, ethical leadership. It's like, how do you do that if you don't have a strong moral character as a basis for that?
Mm-hmm. And I would agree with that 100%. I mean, and I know we'll talk about this in more detail. There is certainly, when we talk about ethical leadership, there are, I think, two components of that. And let me step back and define it, at least as I see ethical
Sure.
leadership. I mean, simplistically, I think ethical leadership is both doing the right thing and influencing others to do the right thing. So, and that gets to your concept around the morality or doing what is morally appropriate. We further divide that to say, and let me see if I can partition this accurately for you. I can be the most moral, ethical person in the world, but if I'm a lousy leader, to some extent, it's so what, right?
Right.
So the way we approach the topic in the book is to say, first and foremost, you have to be a good leader. Then, secondly, you have to be a person of high character, ethics, morals, etc. Combine the two, then you've got an ethical leader. But you can't be one without the other. Putting that somewhat simplistically.
This is an interesting term because we're looking at society right now, and
Hmm.
it's really hard in my mind to find ethical leaders. So as you look at the role ethical leaders play in today's culture and just organizations in general,
Hmm.
how do you incorporate that into what you do in your profession?
Boy, that's a loaded question. I could go on at some length. Let me give you three answers to that, Keith. The first is, and I do this a lot in my area. Our belief is culture supersedes all, and what I mean by that is I can be an ethical person, and when I speak to groups, by the way, and I say, how many of you consider yourself to be ethical person? 100% will raise their hand and say yes. But there's research that says if you're confronted with an ethical dilemma or you see malfeasance in some way, shape, or form, less than 50% report that. So that's a dichotomy, and it fascinates me, right? Because we all think we're ethical, but when push comes to shove, we may not behave ethically. And fundamentally, I think a lot of that is culture, the organizational culture. Does it support speaking up? Does it support doing the right thing? So we do a lot of work with organizations on culture and developing culture. And then secondarily, the logical question that follows from that is if I want an ethical organization, I need ethical leaders to populate it. So we do a lot of work with selecting ethical leaders as well, which is probably those two are the major focuses of what we're doing right now.
I've done a lot of HR type stuff in my church body before.
Sure.
How do you how do you test for or search for ethical leaders? What questions do you ask to get at the heart of the ethical leader?
Yeah, let me give you two answers, and I can't speak to church setting, right?
Right.
Uh, I can, but not from the same perspective that you do. Um, so I think it's a complex question in my world, which is predominantly the business world. If you talk about searches for people, or you talk about processes for selecting people, and I've done this for 30 years now. When it comes to ethics, most of the people will talk about integrity, okay, as a measurement tool. But integrity to me is kind of like Potter Stewart's definition of pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it.
Right.
I think that's true for integrity. There are multiple definitions, and it's really, really hard, I think, in a selection process. I don't care if you're a pastor or any other setting to measure integrity, quite honestly. I mean, because most of the measures of integrity will suggest I can test and say I'm a high integrity guy, but it doesn't predict my behavior on the job. Okay. Um, Nor, by the way, do most interviews. If and I'm not a psychologist by background, but most interview processes statistically, are kind of feel good processes, unless they're really systematic and done well. Um, my mother was a church secretary in the Methodist Church for years, so I'm somewhat familiar with the whole process of pastors coming into a new church, those kinds of things. And a lot of it's touchy feely, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, does a person resonate with us? Do they appear to be a person of faith? Do they appear to be a person of integrity? But that's really, really difficult to measure, at least in my humble opinion. My belief, and I think this is true in any organization, is we're really going after the wrong target there. I mean, and what I mean by that is if I truly want ethical leaders, I need to step back and say, what do ethical leaders do? Because you can measure that. And I think they do a couple things, just briefly. One is they take a stand. And I'll draw that directly to the church as I've been associated with. And like the pastors that I enjoyed were the ones who stood up and took a stand on social issues. They weren't afraid. And I think that's true for ethical leaders. They take a stand regardless of the situation. Secondly, they have to be able, this goes back to your comment about morality, they have to be able to discern right from wrong. Not everybody can, right? Or not everybody pays attention to it, particularly in the business world. And thirdly, and there are a host of other variables on that, they need the ability to think critically because they need to evaluate way, right, and wrong. So, in my mind, from an evaluation perspective, whether it's a pastor or a business person, I can say, can you take a stand? I can discover that. I can get examples of that. I can get examples of critical reasoning, and I can get examples because I use moral dilemmas or other situations of how does somebody in fact think about right and wrong. And I would tell you, and you can, I'm curious about your response to this. I don't think everybody does, or not everybody doesn't not necessarily see shades of gray or ambiguity. There's a subset of the population, I think, who wants right and wrong be defined absolutely, um, and be defined by somebody else, and I measure myself against that standard. But there's no ambiguity. If X situation occurs, this is the Y prescribed response. I don't think that works in most situations because I think right and wrong is more nuanced, um, and with way, way, way more shades of gray. So I digress. I can obviously go on at some length on that, but
No, I think that was good. And you talk about the right and wrong and the shades of gray. I think for the church, I think when the church has gotten itself in trouble is when we have too much gray. And we hedge on too many things that maybe aren't really are black and white, and we've made everything almost gray in some in some cases. And I think that's kind of been, and so it's kind of watered down some of its impact by the amount of gray we have.
yeah, let me. I'll take a risk here, but I'll give you my perspective. So I come out of a fairly mainstream Protestant background, um, and remain mystified, and I'll name names here and probably get in trouble for it, about the evangelical support for President Trump because and I certainly understand the the sense that he may support certain positions we take, but I remain mystified, as do many of the evangelicals I talk to, about how his character is evaluated in that, given some of the fairly publicly known things about him and things he's done in the past. So I agree with your comment, I think. Um, and I'm mystified by how it gets played out in some cases.
Yeah, I think church and politics. Somebody said to me, the church needs to be careful of picking sides.
Hmm.
The church's responsibility is to be a light. And I think
Hmm.
if we get into one side or the other, we have to get in bed with things that we don't agree with, and it does impact our ability to be a witness.
Boy, I think that's saying a lot and saying it very, very well. My stepmother is her first husband was a Methodist pastor and I've just watched the agony she's gone through with the Methodist Church issues around gay marriage, gay clergy, etc. And I'm not taking a position on that, but it horribly divisive. But and because it's dealing with an issue as opposed to the spirit and faith, if that
Right.
makes any sense.
It does, exactly.
So
Yeah, no. There's no easy answers in this society, is there?
I was hoping you were going to provide it today, but I guess you're not.
So let's get into your book, because I think I want to dig deeper into this, because you authored the book, The Practice of Ethical Leadership. What motivated you to write this book?
You know, two things, well, three things really. But the first is when I was in graduate school, again, a long time ago, I was exposed to the work of Lawrence Kohlberg. And Kohlberg he's now passed away, a developmental psychologist that looked at basically different stages of how people reason about moral dilemmas, which I found fascinating. They just the whole reasoning process. The second piece is, and we've talked about this tangentially, mystified at points about why really smart people do dumb things ethically. You know, I mean, and I'm not sure we answered it in the book, by the way, because it's still an open question. And then the third piece, and this is just pure chance, my co-author and I happened to meet. We met back in 2017 in a business situation. He's German. Um, and we continued a correspondence after we met initially. And I think he may have said, or one of us said, hey, you know, I'm kind of interested in ethical leadership. And that was a trigger, and we went from there. So, long history of interest triggered mostly by my co-author Florian saying maybe we should write a book about it, which we did. So
I love that. So what are the key messages you hope readers take away from reading your book?
I think there are three, Keith, two of which I've alluded to before. One is if I don't care where you are, church, school, whatever, be sensitive, aware of the organizational culture that you work in. I mean, the culture's got to reinforce behaving in the correct manner. And by the way, I am not an ethicist by trade. I believe in process ethics. So what I mean by that is the culture's got to talk about it openly. What do we believe as a church about right and wrong? Share opinions. What are our values? Those kind of things. So knowing the culture. Secondly, and I said this before, um, I think we need to hire ethical leaders consciously. Um, let me build on that for just a second. I said earlier, I think ethical leaders stand up and take a position. I think the third takeaway out of the book, in my mind, is if we expect our leaders to stand up and take a position, we need to as well. And I mean that by the common member. I need to be willing to speak up in potentially uncomfortable situations and say, I disagree. You know, I think of Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses on the wall in Wittenberg. You know, he basically stood up and said, "I can do no other. I have to object." I think the common person has to object at points. If we expect that of our leaders, we need to expect it of ourselves.
I love that. And today's culture doesn't let you do that easily, because if you stand up with a strong opinion that the majority or the loudest majority has something to say about, there is such pushback. People are afraid to stand up and voice their opinion.
That in between you and me, and that just scares me to death. I mean, I think, and this is pure opinion. I've never thought that the U.S. Congress was a sanctuary of ethical leaders. I mean, they by and large take politically expedient positions, and I think many of us would agree with that, right?
Right.
And you can look at the current situation and say that's probably true. I think at the local level where you and I work in our communities, the nature of that discord has changed dramatically. I mean, I look at my local community is now dealing with you got libraries dealing with what content should be on our bookshelves, and you can run down the list. How do we deal with homeless people on the streets? But speaking up on that, particularly taking a is fraught with risk. I mean, I offend my friends. I think The threat of violence is just below the surface, and I think that's a new issue. But I think it takes a significant act of courage in many cases for people to step up, because there is the risk of retribution, retaliation, and it's a different world than I don't know how old you are, but when I grew up, you could see somebody speak on TV and take a position that you opposed, and assume that person was going to be relatively safe. I wouldn't know if I wanted to how to find where that person lived. I wouldn't think about going to confront him or her in a family situation or bringing their family into the matter. And now it's almost instantaneous. I mean, if I speak up at my local library and say I'm opposed to censorship, people can listen to me while I'm online, probably know exactly where I live, all those kinds of things, almost instantaneously. And if they choose to retaliate in any way, can do that almost instantaneously as well. That's a much different dynamic than it was, I think, 20 and 30 years ago.
So knowing those challenges you just mentioned, or we just got done talking about, how does that impact even more the ethical leader in whether it's business or the church or whatever organization you're part of? How do those factors factor into the ethical leadership decision making?
Boy, that's a really complex question. I think I'm not sure it always does. I mean, I think the the truly ethical leaders. I'll give you two business examples that come to mind for me. Um, are innately wired to do the right thing and take a stand. Um, and I'll give you one from my own experience. I live in Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh is the home to Dick's Sporting Goods, which you probably know because it's everywhere. And at the time, Joe Stack was the CEO and chairman of the board, and he was the CEO at the time of Sandy Hook, the school shooting, and Dick's make a lot of money with sportsmen, right? They sell a lot of fishing gear, hunting gear, etc. Stack made the decision immediately to remove assault weapons from his stores, and he did so knowing that that had some impact on his traditional bottom line. But in his mind, it was absolutely the right decision. And if he lost customers, he didn't care. That to me is something innate about Joe's values, what he stands for, and the immediacy of response. And I think that's what truly ethical leaders do. I mean, if we think about Martin Luther King or any of the people that come to mind immediately, if you think about historical or national figures, they were innately courageous and willing to take those stands. And I don't have an answer about how we do that in today's world because it's much more difficult. But I do think there are examples out there in our everyday world where people do that on a regular basis.
Great. We got to mention your partner in writing this book, your co-author Florian. What were some of the things? Describe the collaboration process for us as you guys wrote this book together.
Well, so this is a great story. I think. Hopefully I can make it a great story. So as I said, we met in 2017 in the United States. Florian then came to visit within the next year, my wife and myself. So that was 2017. I haven't seen him since. So in the middle of all this, so we decided to write the book. Pandemic occurs. The pandemic is the greatest blessing, and I don't being somewhat facetious about it, to collaborating as writers because we did everything you can think of from a collaboration process. We just did it all virtually. So we did regular meetings, we exchanged drafts, we argued with one another. The only difference being we did it via Zoom as opposed to being face to face. But and the other part of that, which is interesting for me, is we're distinctly different generations. Florian's probably in his 40s and I'm in my 70s. Obviously, he's German. I'm not. Has a very much more of a global orientation. He has much more of a global orientation and certainly a European orientation. So we'd spend a lot of time arguing politics as well. I mean, we started the book um, when Trump was in his initial term, and I tread lightly here. as president. And so we'd spent a lot of time, and I'm not a Republican, trying to interpret how the American people were dealing with all this to Florian, because they follow the news over there very, very closely and are mystified by much of it. So throughout that, so that's the simple answer on the collaboration. We became friends. He got married. Each suffered death of parents. So we have this virtual relationship that is uh, very, very close, and we haven't seen each other in 7 years.
I love that. I'm thinking
I'm
of
not
writing a book with my friend now, so we're trying to figure out how we're going to do it. So,
Oh, well, we'll talk about that offline. My wife and I collaborated on one book, and we're still married, so that's a good sign. But there are some difficult points in that process, and I know you've written one yourself. So collaboration is a tricky one, I think.
it
So,
was easy to write by myself, though.
oh
I
yeah,
only argue with myself.
right, no question. Or your spouse or whomever else reads your stuff. But
Right.
yeah, you have the final say. It's much trickier when you both have to agree on final words and stuff. So the other quick comment, since you asked on that, Keith, we made some decisions initially as we outlined the book to say, okay, here are our, I think we had 13 chapters originally. And so we divided up the initial work on each chapter based on individual interests. So Florian would write chapter one, I'd write chapter two, we'd exchange copy, edit, etc. But each of us took kind of primary responsibility. I can't imagine collaborating where you're actually doing sentence by sentence
Oh, my
collaboration.
word. Yeah, that would be different.
Yeah, it'd be very hard, I think.
One of the things that we haven't talked about, but your book discusses the role of love and authenticity in leadership. Can you
Hmm.
elaborate on those principles? Because sometimes those principles are foreign in some of our conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to go back to Potter Stewart to some extent. I mean, I think we believe, and our research supports this, that ethical leaders are truly authentic. And I mean that in the sense that they're willing to show themselves, they're willing to show vulnerability, um, they're willing to accept disagreement, um, they're willing to engage in dialogue. And I know you asked because you shared some of the questions initially. One of the dilemmas, I think, for lots of ethical leaders, authentic ethical leaders, is how do I lead when I disagree with the decisions that's been made at top. Um, I think that is a constant dilemma for ethical leaders to be authentic in that situation, because so often, and I see you nodding. I've been in situations where somebody else made a decision. They said, Rick, go implement this. I didn't agree with it necessarily. And then I had to go implement it and try and be genuine in that situation. And I think that's really a balancing act, because people know when you're not genuine. I mean, or authentic, I think. Um, and what I found for myself, and I think what most of the ethical leaders do, is say, the authentic ones, is to say, I'm not 100% on board with this. I know we all have concerns. So they demonstrate empathy. They're willing to share, again, vulnerability, but we have to make it work. But that to me is more authentic than saying, we're going to do this, boom, boom, boom. So that's the authenticity part. The love piece to me is more kind of the Greek agape form of love. I mean, you have to love your fellow man. And, and I think good leaders, and I'd be curious about your reaction, demonstrate that on a daily basis by the attention they pay to you. I mean, when I think of the great ethical leaders that I've been with, and I've worked with a number that I thought were that way, they gave complete focus to me when I talked to them. They were present, focused, and concerned about what I had to say. They listened well, they were polite, and clearly cared about me as a human being. And I think that's what we're really saying about love. Um, and I think so. I mean, it's somewhat opinion, but I think you've got to be authentic, and fundamentally, you got to love your fellow man, which is not always easy to do.
No. And it's hard to follow a leader you don't think cares about you,
Absolutely true.
especially if you disagree with where they're going. It's so easy to dismiss them or not give your all to whatever decision has been made from the top if you don't think the leader cares about you.
Yeah, I mean, you probably follow some of this research, and I know you've got kind of an audience that's some business and some church relationship, but the whole great resignation that occurred after the pandemic as people came back to work, most of the research that I've seen says a good bit of the reason why people left is to exactly to your point. They realized I was following somebody I didn't trust, somebody who wasn't genuine, and or they didn't care about me as a human being. Most of the data that I've seen suggests that's why they left. And most of the data I see says historically that's why people leave organizations and positions as well.
So you talk about your research. I'm curious for you. I just got to doing some research myself, and there's always some findings that surprise you. What was the most surprising stat or data you found in your research?
Boy, that's a wonderful question. The most surprising thing, frankly, to me, and it's not, well, it came through our research. Another firm did the research, a group called Ethisphere. Um, and the biggest piece of that was to say, this goes back to the retaliation piece, but the two things that jump out in their research about why people don't speak up or stand up, fear of retaliation, we talked about that. Um, and then secondly, the assumption that no one would do anything about it if I did speak up. And those both of those scare me. I mean, and I'm sure we can all see on a daily basis where somebody comes forward with a claim of sexual harassment that has been reported, for example, and no one's done about it. So there's a lot of reinforcement on both those counts. Um, so I would guess I would say that both that surprised me and depressed me, frankly, as well, because I think it's a accurate statement of today's society, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think I agree with you on that. And we goes back to our idea we talked about before was it's hard to be ethical when you have this fear of retaliation on you, whether it's at the job or in society in general.
Hmm.
What
No,
research? What research did you find that verified what your assumption, your hypothesis was? He was like, okay, good. I'm glad the research verified what I was thinking.
most of the research that is verification is anecdotal, and what I mean by that is we did a fair amount of research that on biographical research. I mean, looking at well-known and not so well-known figures to say are there commonalities there, and matched that up then with what we did basically news story searches where so for example we can validate I think the notion that standing up for what you believe is a critical component of ethical leadership from the biographical research as well as the more experiential stuff. People do respect stand-up people, and there's risk. Don't misunderstand me, and you know this as well as I. There's risk associated with that, whether it's in the church or business situation. At the end of the day, those are the people I think we respect. So
I love it.
that's the validation for me.
As you look at your research, what would you say left you as wanting to know more when you got done research? Like, so we did all this and we left this on the table and we should really dig deeper in, or someone should dig deeper into what we came up with.
Yeah, here's the big one in my mind, and this goes right to what you do. And because my focus, because I've done this professionally for 30 years, so my bias is around organizational culture and hiring good leaders. The open question for me remains: can I develop ethical leaders? Can I? And it's kind of the church question to say: can I develop people of high character who reason effectively about moral issues? And honestly, I'll tell you, I think the jury's out on that one. I mean, there's a fair amount of data. I'll give you a specific name, for example. So I come out of the corporate environment where historically you do lots of training around pick a social justice issue, pick a issue. I mean, I'll take sexual harassment. 20 years ago, it was a big topic. I'll bet Harvey Weinstein went through sexual harassment training at his organization. Did it change Harvey's behavior? I don't think so. And that's the dilemma with the development piece, and I think the dilemma for churches. Um, does what we teach in church, because you teach right and wrong, you teach the Ten Commandments, you teach the Sermon on the Mount, whatever those religious and ethical standards are, does that translate into behavior? Um, and for a lot of people, it does. Don't misunderstand me. For many, many people who are devout, thinking people, they're going to behave ethically, but it misses the mark somehow on a number of people, and that's the dilemma. That's what we haven't solved, I think. So when you write your next book and you've solved it, let me know.
I'll definitely call and you can invite me and we can talk about it. I am curious as you think about how this book has impacted you and your view of leadership. What would you say? How has it changed you?
I think where it's changed me, Keith, is more to give me a mission. And what I mean by that is, I've been doing basically HR kind of stuff for most of my career, and I do it really well, and I've continue to do it even though I've retired at least once. Um, but now what the book has done is give me a mission to say I want to help organizations be more ethical, um, and I don't care what the organization is. And I want to help them, give them tools and assistance so they can hire more ethical leaders. And that's given me a focus that I don't think I probably had 8 or 10 years ago. And I guess and I it kind of uncomfortable with the phrase, but a vision of where I want to go for the rest of my life.
Well, I think that's really positive. So as you look at this book,
Hmm.
what do you hope that how do you hope it transforms, I guess, those corporations who pick it up and read it? How would they take it and apply it to what they're doing?
I'll give you two answers to that. One's corporate and one's nonprofit. Um, on the corporate side, and again, because all the data I have, experiential, says that corporations don't pay much attention to this. So I would hope corporations would, through the result of the book and other efforts, pay as much attention to the ethical bottom line as they do to the traditional bottom line. Meaning, are we doing the right thing in our community, for the environment, et cetera? And some do. Um, it's a little bit different on the nonprofit side, I think because of size and orientation. And I say this just because I did a speaking engagement just the other day, and most of the people in the audience were nonprofit, and a lot of them were board members, and their orientation was, I really want ethical leaders in my nonprofit volunteer organization. There, it's more of an educational piece to say, okay, there are tools you can do that with. Here they are. Go forth and do that. Um, and I say that all the best intentions in the world, but not necessarily the most sophisticated, because they're in many cases small local organizations run by volunteers, and maybe one or two professional staff. And really, the question there is, can you give people the tools in a practical way to ensure that their leadership is ethical? I think.
Right. That's really important. And there's a difference between the way nonprofits and for-profit businesses just operate and think in general.
That's absolutely true. But the there's a difference in terms of how they measure the bottom line.
Right.
Um, but I would say the results of being unethical are as catastrophic for both groups. And I say that because and some of it's perception. If I read about a scandal in a local nonprofit, which is frequently around funding, right? Um, I'm going to withhold my funds. I'm not going to contribute anymore, and that's the lifeblood of those organizations. So it's just as disastrous for a nonprofit as it is for a company like Boeing right now, who you can argue unintentionally is unethical, but causes real question about their product and service. And am I going to invest in Boeing? So in both cases, the results of being unethical, I think, are catastrophic, regardless of how you look at it. Are people going to make an investment on you if you're unethical? And the data suggests probably not.
And with a place like Boeing, their unethicalness scans from not just their industry, but airlines, because all the planes are made by Boeing, just about. So it impacts the airline industry as a whole.
Yeah. Can I give you a quick story? I know
Sure.
we're pushing time. So, but I use this story. So I talk frequently because I think it illustrates where I'm headed with this about Bombas, Boeing, and the National Rifle Association. So I don't know if you know Bombas.
I do.
Bombas,
The sock place, right?
yeah. So Bombas's whole proposition, they're an apparel company. They started making socks, and their whole proposition was for every pair of socks you buy, we donate a pair to a homeless shelter. They've been in business now for 10 years. They're about a $500 million company. And I step back at that and say, I want to buy Bombas socks. I step back and think, if I'm the janitor, I can go to work every day and feel really good about what I do. Okay. So that's one organization. And that's just an example. Boeing, I think, and I don't know Boeing that well, and certainly don't know the people in it. I think unintentionally made a number of decisions, bottom line driven decisions around dollars, quality, et cetera, that resulted in them missing their core value, which is keeping passengers safe. So unintentionally, I think, they made decisions that make them look unethical. So, but that's fixable, but they need attention to it. The National Rifle Association, and I know you're out in Iowa, so you may have supporters out there. I think is a different example, and there you've got the leadership of the National Rifle Association, who basically used the dues of members to support lifestyle decisions. And that's been fairly public, ended up in court. And that to me was a conscious act of unethical behavior in those cases. And if you look at the data, they've lost about 25% of their members as a result of that. So you've got Bombas, I think, which is this fabulous example, and there are lots of them out there, of well-intentioned organizations that provide meaning for people and their employees. You've got a middle group, which is kind of the Boeing, which make decisions that I don't think are intentionally unethical, but result in them being unethical. And then you've got a third group where the culture is such that it doesn't put brakes on unethical or illegal or immoral behavior. So to me, all three of those are powerful images.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, as you think about what this season of your life is, what are you most excited about?
This season of my life. Okay, the complete cards on the table. So I'm 75. I retired 10 years ago, and it didn't stick. I missed people. And so that's when I more formally started my company, Arch Performance. I guess I'm most excited about staying engaged for the near future. That I can get up. I see this with my in-laws. My in-laws are 91 and 99, and they get up every day. They've got a purpose, and that may be I'm going to make lunch. I'm going to work in the garden, but it drives them and it keeps them alive, and that's what I've got right now. So that's what excites me. That I can still try and make a difference with people. I can engage in meaningful ways, and frankly, keep myself intellectually alive as well.
Love that. This is my favorite question to ask my guests.
Okay.
What do you want your legacy to be?
Oh, that's a great question. I had that question from somebody else, and I don't think about things in as a legacy. I mean, I don't do anything that, that where I consciously say this is a legacy moment. When I'm gone, I think I want the traditional things. I want my family to miss me. I want them to think of me as a good father and a good person. And if I've done that, that's my legacy.
Good answer. I like that. Good. As we wrap this conversation up, what takeaway do you want the audience to have from our conversation?
Two things. I think your audience has a responsibility to the organizations they're in to support the organization in being ethical and promoting ethical leaders. But all that's meaningless if they're not ethical and can't stand up for themselves.
Good.
Because at the end of the day, I think ethics and morality is intensely personal.
It's very, very true. So, Rick, where can people find you and buy your book, The Practice of Ethical Leadership?
Well, obviously the common places like Google. We also have a website, which is ethicalbottomline.com, which I would encourage your readers to go to. Again, it's ethicalbottomline.com. And the reason being there, you can get the book a little cheaper than you can on some of the other sources.
There you go. We love saving money, don't we?
I do, at least. Yes.
Well, Rick, thanks so much for taking the time to be on and providing such great content and reminding us of the importance of ethical leadership. And no matter what realm we are, because I think we're all leaders, because leadership is about influence. So we always influence somebody.
I appreciate it, Keith. This has been a delightful conversation. I wish you all the best, and thank you for the time.
Well, thank you, Rick.
Thanks for listening to Becoming Bridge Builder. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help support the podcast, please subscribe and share it with others. Post about it on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at @BKeithHaney and on Getter and Twitter @RevHeadpin. Thanks again and tune in next time.